Hello. Thank you all for coming out. As Dina said, I'm Ranya Khalek, and I write for the Electronic Intifada. How many of you here read the Electronic Intifada? Yay, that's awesome. So the Electronic Intifada is incredible. I love writing for it. It's an alternative media outlet, and I think that in a lot of ways, what's happening right now around this issue is incredible because there's such a hunger and an appetite to understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine from the perspectives that we're talking about. And because of social media, in particular, we're able to have this bigger platform where we can use sites like the Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss and other forms of alternative media to report on parts of Israel-Palestine that aren't getting reported on in the mainstream press, and to push things like what Max mentioned, which was our JSIL hashtag. If anyone doesn't know what a hashtag is, if you use Twitter, a hashtag is like the number sign in front of whatever it is, the word you're using or letters that you're trying to go viral. And in the case of JSIL, we pushed it so hard, it really did go viral. And to the extent that now, if you even click on the JSIL hashtag on Twitter, I mean, people still use it just to update what's happening in Israel-Palestine. You'll just have see a news feed of incitement to violence by Israeli leaders or whatever awful things took place on that given day. So it really is incredible what social media is able to do. I mean, it's not just using hashtags to get news to go viral that we're not seeing in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but it's also the fact that it gives an outlet to Palestinians themselves to speak completely unfiltered to the outside world about what's happening in Gaza, for example. You could read through your Twitter feed and see lots of Palestinians talking about bombs falling and giving quotes that you otherwise wouldn't get through, again, the New York Times or the Washington Post. So the mainstream media doesn't really have a monopoly anymore on what we hear about Israel-Palestine. At the same time, that they still are sort of the predominant news media outlet. And so we don't get to hear about some of the violent rhetoric and incitement that's coming out of Israel. Israeli society, and this is something that I do, at the Electronic Intifada and my colleagues do, is we do try and highlight the kinds of violent rhetoric, whether it's incitement to genocide or incitement to murder, which is so routine from Israeli leaders. We try and highlight that at the Electronic Intifada. It's kind of incredible because, Israeli leaders, sometimes I wonder what it is they have to say to make a headline in the New York Times. Last year, just before Gaza started being bombed, Ayelet Shaked, I'm sure most of you have heard about this. Ayelet Shaked, who's now the justice minister in Israel, she was promoted after making these statements, issued a call to genocide. She called for the slaughter of Palestinian mothers in their beds to prevent them from birthing what she called little snakes. This is the language of genocide. EI made this go viral, but you didn't see headlines across the mainstream press in this country, which is utterly shocking when you have an actual leader of a state that we're providing so many weapons to, making genocidal statements about a completely vulnerable population. Last summer, we talk about the extremism, and we talk about Islamic extremism a lot. When Israeli leaders like to promote the idea that Palestinians are all extremists and religious fanatics. Well, last summer, on the eve of the ground invasion in Gaza, the commander of the Givati Brigade, Ofer Winter, informed his soldiers that they were fighting a Jewish holy war to punish the blasphemous Palestinians of Gaza. This too we did not hear in the US mainstream press. Ofer Winter, the same commander who was celebrated after the Gaza slaughter as a hero, he afterwards bragged about what his soldiers did in Rafah on Black Friday when they killed some 200 Palestinians in a massive carpet bombing campaign. He said, we shredded them. And he bragged about it, and he also said that his soldiers were protected by divine clouds of glory because they were, the right religion and the people they were killing were the wrong. You could just there's an endless list. Earlier this year, the Israeli defense minister, Moshe Dayan, Moshe Ya'alon, excuse me, I'm mixing up my Israeli fanatics from the past. He threatened to nuke Iran Like at a conference, he threatened to nuke Iran. I mean, can you imagine? Iran breathes wrong, and it gets a headline in the New York Times. An Israeli leader threatened to nuke Iran, and then after that, he also promised that in any future conflict with either Hamas or Hezbollah, that Palestinian and Lebanese civilians would be killed, that Israel would hurt Palestinian and Lebanese civilians, including children. That's like almost a direct quote. He said this openly at a conference, and this is something that I think only the Electronic Intifada reported. So my point is that alternative media outlets are so important at the moment, and so is social media and what you guys push out from what we're reporting in social media, because we do see this side of Israel that we don't see anywhere else. And I want to move over for a moment just to some of the reporting that I do, because I think that one of the most effective ways to draw attention to the kind of information we need to push back against Israeli propaganda is something that I do try to highlight, which is the sort of connections that exist between what's happening in Israel, what Israel's doing to Palestinians, and what's happening in other parts of the world, including the US. Right now, in Israel-Palestine, there's been, I believe, over 80 Palestinians since October 1st who've been killed by Israeli forces, many of them in what human rights organizations like Amnesty International are calling summary executions. And this is, this is because, there's been, Palestinians have been pushing back, there's been knife attacks, there's been this sort of tit-for-tat violence, and of course, a few Israelis have died. But the point is that you have Israeli forces running around basically executing Palestinians if they, suspect them of having potato peelers or knives. And so right now, as we speak, there is a delegation of American police executives of American police officers from some 15 different US police departments that are in Israel, Palestine, basically observing and specifically learning from Israeli police and soldiers how they're dealing with Palestinians at the moment. So they're basically taking lessons in how to summarily execute people. Now, over the past couple months, since this new explosion in violence in Israel-Palestine has been taking place, there's been several snuff films, right? Films, video recordings of Palestinians being killed, some of them being taunted after they've been shot. In one case, an Eritrean refugee was beaten to death by a lynch mob after being shot for being supposedly confused for an attacker. We've been seeing these films come out of Israel-Palestine. It's very, very disturbing and disgusting. And there's been a sort of parallel taking place in this country as well, where right now in this city, in Chicago, there was a recent snuff film of Laquan McDonald, who was shot dead by police. So, we have a police issue in this country where people are being gunned down in the streets by people who are supposed to be protecting their communities. And those same exact police departments are traveling to Israel-Palestine to learn lessons in occupation enforcement since 2001. Almost every single American police department has traveled to Israel at some point to learn occupation tactics under the cover of counterterrorism training. So these connections are very real. Right now you see a lot of solidarity, a lot of coalition building taking place between black groups in this country, particularly Black Lives Matter, and Palestinians. And that's not just because they're both, disenfranchised populations that are dealing with state violence. It has to do with very concrete connections that are taking place where their oppressors are working together. And it goes beyond just that. Israel, in many ways, uses Palestine as a laboratory to test and perfect methods and weapons of domination and control. And this is something that you don't see in the mainstream press either, but we do push in social media, and I try and push in my reporting, and Max does as well. In the case of borders, right now there's a refugee crisis in Europe taking place. Israeli leaders are very, very excited about this crisis. Dor Gold, the director of Israel's foreign ministry, after a recent explosion in refugees going into Europe and this sort of right-wing backlash taking place a couple months ago, he sort of quietly celebrated the fact that this means that Europe is going to shift further to the right, or shift to the right, and because of this backlash towards refugees, and that would make Europe more aligned with Israel and make Europe understand Israel's security concerns better. Why? Because Israel's a country that despises refugees. It creates them and produces them. Palestinian refugees, and then it also refuses to allow any refugees inside because it wants to maintain its Jewish demographic majority. Israel's also really, really good at building walls. That's something that it excels at, and we should give Israel credit for that. It does build really nice walls, right? And those walls, some countries in Europe are trying to replicate those walls. Countries like Hungary, which is run by a fascist man named Viktor Orban, is procuring Israeli technology that's used to keep Palestinians walled in throughout the West Bank and walled out of Israel, or present-day Israel. That same technology is going to be used at European borders to keep refugees out who are fleeing violence. The same with the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico border, the Department of Homeland Security gave Israel's largest military technology firm, Elbit Systems, a grant to build a virtual surveillance fence at our own border, using the same exact technology that's used to build and maintain the apartheid wall in Palestine. So, Netanyahu likes to say, or, Israelis like to say that wall is for security to keep suicide bombers out, but even Netanyahu himself has said that the purpose of the wall is to prevent demographic spillover, is what he calls it. So I guess to prevent Palestinians from contaminating Israel's ethnic purity. And so you can kind of think about our own wall using the same technology, trying to do the same thing in this country to keep out, I guess, poor Latinos from contaminating the ethnic purity of the U.S. So the point is, I guess, is that Israel is a country that is run by a bunch of Donald Trumps, and drawing these kinds of connections between, because in this country, liberals are very, very, very disgusted by police killings, as they should be. They're very disgusted by the Islamophobia, a lot of it, using rhetoric that comes kind of directly from Israeli propaganda. And so, by drawing these sorts of connections, between what Israel's doing and how it impacts what's happening here, it sort of forces people to understand, to contextualize what Israel's doing and understand the violence that's taking place in a different kind of way. So I think it's really exciting that we have social media and we have Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss and amazing authors like Max and to sort of push this narrative, and we do see it starting to move into the mainstream. So I guess in the meantime, the only question is, how long is it going to take the mainstream media to finally, adopt that narrative? And I see some hope in that. It's going a little too slowly. But, for now, I think one of the most important things to focus on is, that Israel's shifting further and further to the right. And the best thing you can do, aside from, writing letters to the editor, is, use your own platform on Facebook and Twitter to share what's taking place and to push back against propaganda, because Israeli propaganda is it's not smart. It's very, very easy to debunk. Most of it is based on no evidence whatsoever, sometimes cartoons, as you mentioned earlier. So yeah, I encourage the rest of you as well, use the hashtag JSOL, do as Max said, and push back against Israel's narratives, and turn them upside down on their heads, because oftentimes they're projections, and make sure that when an Israeli leader makes a comment inciting against Palestinians or makes a genocidal statement, you share it, and there's plenty to go around. Thank you.